Long before the flames of Troy lit the night sky, before warriors clashed upon the shores of the Aegean, there was a girl born of both mortal and divine legacy. Helen was her name, and even in her earliest years, the world seemed to whisper about her beauty. She was the daughter of Zeus, the thunder-wielding king of Olympus, and Leda, queen of Sparta. Her conception was surrounded by tales of mystery. Some said Zeus took the form of a swan and descended upon Leda, leaving her with an egg from which Helen emerged. Others whispered darker versions, but all agreed on one thing: Helen was no ordinary child. From the moment she grew into maidenhood, her presence unsettled kingdoms. Beauty, in the ancient world, was not merely an adornment. It was power, as sharp as a blade, as intoxicating as wine, and as dangerous as a storm at sea. Men who gazed upon Helen felt their hearts stir, their reason falter, their ambitions twist. Poets later said that even as a girl, her radiance rivaled the dawn itself. Her brothers, Castor and Pollux, famed as the Dioscuri, often stood guard over her, for suitors came from every corner of Greece. Yet Helen's destiny was not to be quietly married into obscurity. She was chosen by the gods themselves to be the spark of a war that would echo through ages. Yet destiny turned elsewhere. In Troy, a prince named Paris, son of Priam and Hecuba, lived under a dark prophecy. As an infant, he was foretold to bring Troy's destruction. Abandoned on Mount Ida, he was raised by shepherds until his true identity was revealed. Handsome, graceful, and charming, Paris would soon face a choice that reshaped the world. The tale began at the wedding feast of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. All gods were invited except Eris, goddess of discord. In anger, she hurled a golden apple marked for the fairest. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Zeus refused to judge and appointed Paris instead. On Mount Ida, each goddess bribed him. Hera offered kingship and dominion. Athena promised wisdom and victory. But Aphrodite whispered of love she would grant him the world's most beautiful woman. Paris, swayed by desire, awarded her the apple. Thus, fate was sealed. The woman Aphrodite promised was Helen, already wife of Menelaus. Guided by Aphrodite, Paris sailed to Sparta. Menelaus welcomed him as guest, but during his absence, Helen departed with Paris, whether by persuasion, enchantment, or choice. Stories differ. Some say she went willingly, drawn by Paris's charm. Others claim she was bewitched or stolen. Regardless, she left, carrying wealth and the seed of war. When Menelaus returned to find his wife gone, fury consumed him. He called upon the oath sworn by Helen's suitors, summoning all of Greece to arms. Kings and heroes answered, for honor, for glory, and for vengeance. Thus was born the great coalition: Agamemnon, the High King; Odysseus, reluctant but bound; Achilles, the greatest warrior; Ajax, the mighty; and countless others. They raised their sails, bound for Troy, driven by the promise of war and the lure of immortality and song. And Helen, the woman whose face would launch 1,000 ships, stood upon the walls of Troy, her gaze caught between love and regret, knowing the tide of fate was rolling inexorably toward her. The Greek fleet gathered at Aulus's black ships drawn under Agamemnon's command, but the gods demanded a price before war could begin. The wind stilled, the sea lay silent. A seer declared Artemis was angered and would grant passage only if Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. Torn, the king gave the order. Some say the goddess spared the girl, replacing her with a deer. Others say her blood stained the altar. Either way, the winds rose and the fleet sailed for Troy. Behind Troy's gleaming walls, built by Poseidon, King Priam prepared. He summoned his sons Hector, noble and steadfast; Paris, beautiful and doomed; Deiphobus, bold; and Cassandra, cursed to utter truths none would believe. She cried that Helen would destroy them, but her words fell unheeded. The Greeks landed and drove their spears into Trojan soil, swearing not to leave until Helen was restored. Yet war proved long, for the gods themselves divided. Hera and Athena, insulted by Paris, raged against Troy. Aphrodite shielded him, while Apollo armed the Trojans with his bow. Zeus watched with measured restraint, though often his heart leaned toward Troy. Within the walls, Helen lived adorned as a queen, yet restless at heart. Trojan women whispered, some admiring, others condemning her as both victim and curse. She felt the weight of her choices. At times, she sat with Priam on the walls, naming Greek heroes with quiet sorrow. At other times, she lay with Paris, gilded prince, and Aphrodite's chosen. Though a shadow of regret clung to her, she knew thousands bled because of her. The war dragged on without decisive victory. Skirmishes littered the plain, and champions rose on both sides. Among the Greeks, none shone brighter than Achilles, swift-footed son of Peleus and Thetis, nearly invincible, his wrath terrible. Hector, Troy's defender, matched him in nobility, though not in fate. All knew their destinies would one day converge. Paris, though handsome and skilled with the bow, lacked his brother's valor. Many mocked him, saying he stole a wife rather than won her honorably. When Paris faced Menelaus in single combat, the Spartan nearly killed him. At the last instant, Aphrodite veiled her favorite in mist, spiriting him away and leaving the fight unresolved. She then forced Helen back into Paris's chambers. Torn by shame and resentment, she obeyed, knowing she was caught in the goddess's snare. Stories spread of Helen's shifting heart. Some said she longed for Sparta, bitterly regretting her flight. Others whispered she grew fond of Troy, admiring Hector's nobility in contrast to Paris's vanity. But whatever her true feelings, she remained bound by the will of the gods. The war's cruelty deepened. When Agamemnon insulted a Trojan priest of Apollo, plague swept the Greek camp. To appease the god, the king released his captive, but in anger seized Briseis, beloved of Achilles. The insult drove Achilles into fury, and he withdrew from battle. Without him, the Greeks faltered, and the Trojans surged forward. Hector led his men to the very ships, fire licking their hulls. For a moment, Troy seemed destined to prevail, but Patroclus, Achilles' dearest companion, could not bear their suffering. Donning Achilles' armor, he led the Greeks into battle. Though he fought bravely, Hector struck him down. His death shattered Achilles' grief turned to wrath, and wrath to vengeance. Thetis, his mother, begged Hephaestus to forge new armor, shining like the sun. Armed anew, Achilles returned, blazing with fury. The duel between Hector and Achilles became legend. Before Troy's Scion gate, Hector stood alone, courage unshaken, though he knew death awaited. 3 times he fled around the walls before turning to face his foe. Achilles drove his spear through Hector's heart. The prince fell, his body dragged in the dust as Greeks exulted and Trojans wept. Helen too wept. From her chamber, she heard Andromache, Hector's widow, wail with grief. Helen mourned him deeply, for he alone had treated her with kindness, never blaming her though she blamed herself each day. With his death, she felt the curse of her beauty sharpen once a gift. Now, a weapon forged by the gods to wound mankind. Hector's death left Troy bereft of its champion. Night fell heavy, and women wailed through the streets. Priam mourned his son with words that pierced every heart. Even Helen stood among the mourners, speaking of Hector's kindness, confessing that all the ruins seemed born of her presence. Yet grief did not halt war. Achilles, still ablaze with rage, dragged Hector's body round the city walls, day after day, until the gods themselves grew angered. At Zeus's command, Hermes guided Priam in secret to the Greek camp. The aged king clasped Achilles' hands and begged for his son's body. Grief answered grief, and Achilles relented. Hector was returned, honored with rites, his pyre rising into the heavens. Helen watched the smoke and wondered how many more flames would rise before war's end. Without Hector, Troy faltered. Paris, though shielded by Aphrodite, brought little but reproach, yet fate still had use for him. Guided by Apollo, his arrow struck Achilles' heel, the single weakness left unguarded by Thetis' blessings. The greatest Greek fell, as Hector had before him. 2 stars of war were extinguished, yet the struggle raged on. Helen mourned Achilles, not with love, but with dread. His death proved no hero's fall could end the war until Troy itself was destroyed. Her dreams showed her towers aflame, women chained, children slain, but she kept silent. Cassandra's curse had taught her the futility of prophecy. Years dragged by, Ajax the Greater fell to madness, Palamedes to treachery, countless nameless soldiers to dust and steel. Still Troy's walls endured, still the Greeks were. At last, guile succeeded where might had failed. Odysseus conceived a stratagem, a vast wooden horse, hollow and towering, left upon the shore as though abandoned by retreating Greeks. Hidden inside, warriors waited while the fleet sailed from sight. The Trojans debated its fate. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, warned them, beware of Greeks bearing gifts, and hurled his spear into the horse. The echo resounded hollow, yet went unheeded. Serpents from the sea devoured Laocoon and his sons. And the Trojans, seeing divine judgment, dragged the horse within their gates. That night, celebration filled the streets. Believing the war ended, Troy feasted, its people drunk with relief. Helen, uneasy, circled the horse. Some say she imitated the voices of Greek wives, calling softly to test the hidden men. But Odysseus and his comrades held their silence. Suspicion passed. When midnight fell, the horse opened. The hidden warriors struck, killing guards and flinging wide the gates. The fleet, waiting in darkness, returned. Troy awoke to fire and steel. The city that withstood 10 years fell in a single night. Flames consumed temples and palaces, streets ran red. Priam was cut down before Zeus's altar by Neoptolemus, son of Achilles. Cassandra was dragged from Athena's temple, her pleas ignored. Andromache, Hector's widow, was led away in chains, her child hurled from the walls. Helen too was seized, but her fate differed. Menelaus himself confronted her, sword raised, fury burning. For years he had dreamed of striking her down, yet as he gazed upon her, the blade faltered. Whether rekindled love, the spell of her beauty, or the god's decree, he spared her. Helen was taken back across the sea. Thus ended Troy, its towers ash, its people scattered. Helen returned to Sparta, her life spared, but her name bound forever to ruin. For generations, poets sang of her, some damning, some pitying, some exalting her as victim and cause alike. She became the symbol of beauty's peril, the vessel of the gods' quarrels, the woman whose face launched 1,000 ships. And so Helen endured, not only as queen or captive, but is legend eternal as the songs that carried her story through the ages. The smoke of Troy had barely faded when Helen once more sailed aboard a Greek ship, the sea vast around her. Menelaus sat near, sometimes staring with anger, sometimes with the weary gaze of a man who had won a hollow prize. Greece had triumphed, but the victory was bitter. Heroes lay dead, and those who lived faced cursed journeys home. The gods were not finished. Poseidon stirred storms, scattering the fleet. Some ships sank, others drifted to distant shores. Menelaus's voyage stretched into years, his fleet wandering across the islands. Through it all, Helen remained by his side, her presence both balm and wound. Some said she soothed him with gentle words, others that she wove spells to ease his bitterness. At last they reached Egypt, where the Nile spread wide under the sun. Here arose a strange tale. Some poets claimed the Helen at Troy was no mortal woman at all, but a phantom made by the gods. The true Helen, they said, had been hidden in Egypt by Hermes, at Zeus's command, untouched while men died for her shadow. If so, then Paris embraced only an illusion, and Troy burned for a ghost. Yet whether phantom or flesh, none could know. In time Menelaus and Helen returned to Sparta, resuming their thrones, but both were changed. Menelaus bore scars of war. Helen, still radiant, carried the weight of ruin. Her beauty was undimmed yet no longer felt a gift. Wherever she walked, whispers followed traitor, temptress, or victim of the gods. Her later fate splintered into many tales. In some, she lived beside Menelaus in an easy peace until his death. In others, her end was darker. Cast out after Menelaus died, she fled 2 roads, where she was hanged by vengeful hands, or wandered until she vanished on distant shores. Yet other stories raised her beyond mortal grief. Some said she was carried to the Isles of the Blessed, dwelling with heroes in eternal peace, even united with Achilles. Others claimed she was lifted to Olympus itself, immortal, her beauty unmarred, her story eternal. Thus Helen became more than woman. She was myth and symbol, beauty's double-edged power. She was the spark of war, and its victim, desired, despised, yet unforgettable. Poets returned to her name endlessly. Homer cast her as sorrowful, haunted by guilt. Euripides imagined her blameless, hidden away while men destroyed themselves for an illusion. Each retelling reflected human fear, of beauty's sway, of women's power, of God's cruelty, and still her name endures. Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the queen who became legend, the woman whose story echoes through all of history. The memory of Troy did not vanish with its fall. Across Greece, poets carried Helen's tale, reshaping her image into many forms. Some condemned her as a faithless wife who doomed thousands, others pitied her as a victim of gods, her beauty a curse she never wished to bear. Back in Sparta, she walked the palace halls as queen once more, yet shadows of war followed. Women who had lost husbands and sons looked on her with silent accusation. Her robes and sacrifices could not erase the blood tied to her name. Even at home, she was never free of Troy. Menelaus himself wavered between anger and longing. At times his gaze burned with betrayal. At others it softened with memory of the wife he once cherished. Their marriage endured, but beneath it lay silence and storms unspoken. Beyond Sparta, her story grew larger than life. Euripides declared that Helen had never gone to Troy at all, that she had been hidden in Egypt, while a phantom image lured Paris and deceived the Greeks. In this telling, she was innocent, her guilt shifted onto the gods. Yet others remained harsher, casting her as the eternal temptress, a new Pandora whose beauty brought ruin. Helen became a caution, a symbol of desire's destructive power. Still, some revered her. Cults raised shrines in her honor, especially in Sparta and across the Aegean. 2 sailors, her name carried weight, linked to her brothers Castor and Pollux. Guiding lights in the night sky, legends said Helen herself could calm the seas, granting safe passage. Her later years blurred into myth. One tale said that after Menelaus's death, her people turned against her. She fled 2 roads, only to be seized by Queen Polyxo, whose husband had died at Troy. There Helen was hanged in vengeance, her beauty extinguished by mortal hands. Yet other traditions gave her peace. In some, the gods carried her to the Elysian fields, where she wandered among the shades of heroes. There she was reunited either with Achilles, joined by a bond born of war, or with Menelaus. Their love renewed beyond sorrow. The most exalted tale lifted her to Olympus itself. As daughter of Zeus, she was made immortal, her beauty preserved among the gods, worshipped as both blessing and bane. Thus Helen's story became many stories. She was at once guilty and innocent, mortal and divine, destroyer and victim. No single tale contained her, and perhaps that is why she endures. She was never simply a woman of flesh, but the reflection of desire, the spark of conflict, the question without answer. Even now, her name lingers. Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, remains the symbol of beauty's perilous power, caught between the love of men and the will of gods. Whether queen, phantom, or goddess, her story endures, as eternal as the ruins of Troy itself. Long after the fires of Troy had cooled into ash, Helen's name remained alive upon the lips of poets, historians, and philosophers. her story refused to die. For it was never only about a single woman. It was about desire, fate, and the fragile balance between mortals and gods. Across centuries, each age remade Helen according to its fears and longings. In the works of Homer, Helen appears as a figure steeped in sorrow, aware of the devastation tied to her beauty. She sits upon the walls of Troy beside Priam, pointing out the Greek champions with a voice marked by regret. Her presence in the Iliad is not triumphant but mournful, as though she knows her name will forever be bound to ruin. For Homer, she is not demon or goddess, but a woman crushed beneath the weight of destiny. Later poets, however, reshaped her image. In the tragedies of Euripides, Helen was given a startling transformation. In one play, she insists that she never went to Troy at all, that a phantom, a ghostly double, had taken her place, while she remained in Egypt, innocent of betrayal. This daring retelling served not only to absolve her, but also to question the nature of appearances and truth. Was the war fought for a shadow, a lie? If so, then the suffering of men was revealed as folly, their blood spilled for an illusion. Such a version made Helen a victim of divine cruelty, her name stained not by her own choices but by the deceit of the gods. Yet Euripides also painted her differently in other works, sometimes as manipulative, sometimes as calculating, sometimes as a woman capable of wielding her beauty as weapon. This shifting portrayal reflected the unease of Greek society, with women who possessed influence beyond the domestic sphere. Helen was both fascination and fair admired, yet distrusted. Philosophers, too, weighed her legacy. Gorgias the sophist composed an encomium of Helen, a defense that sought to absolve her of blame. He argued that if Helen acted from love, she was compelled by the irresistible force of Eros, a god stronger than mortal will. If she was taken by force, she was a victim. If she was persuaded by words, then speech itself holds divine power, and she cannot be faulted. And if her fate was decreed by the gods, then no human could resist destiny. In every case, Helen stood blameless, her story a mirror reflecting the limits of human freedom before greater powers. Over time, Helen's name crossed beyond Greece, carried into Rome, and beyond. Roman poets inherited her tale, sometimes portraying her as a temptress, sometimes as a tragic queen. In the Aeneid, she appears only in shadow, for Virgil's focus lay upon Troy's survivors and Rome's founding. Yet even in absence, Helen haunted the story, her role as the spark of ruin undeniable. As centuries passed and the world shifted into new empires and faiths, Helen's image adapted again. To Christian thinkers, she became a warning, the embodiment of worldly beauty that led men astray. Her name was invoked as proof of vanity's danger, her legend reshaped into allegory. She was no longer queen or goddess, but symbol and emblem of sin, desire, and downfall. Yet in the imagination of poets, her allure never faded. Medieval romances and Renaissance plays returned to her, not as a moral lesson, but as the eternal muse. To some, she was the unreachable star, the face that launched 1,000 ships, an image of beauty so radiant it defied time itself. To others, she was the specter of destruction, the silent smile behind the clashing of swords. Even philosophers of later ages, pondering the nature of beauty and desire, spoke her name. Was Helen guilty? Or was she the scapegoat of gods and men? Was she the cause of war? Or simply its excuse? Was she an individual with choices? Or a vessel through which fate revealed its hand? Each retelling, each interpretation, answered differently, and none could claim final truth. In this way, Helen of Troy transcended her own life. She became a question, one that echoed through the ages. Can beauty ever be innocent, when its power is enough to sway kingdoms, topple cities, and bend the wills of heroes? As the ages turned, Helen's legend drifted far from the shores of the Aegean. In medieval Europe, where knights sought honor and poets sang of unattainable ladies, her name was revived, not as Queen of Sparta or captive of Troy, but as a symbol of desire that could never be contained. The troubadours of France and the chroniclers of England spoke of her in the same breath as Guinevere, or as Sul women whose beauty bent the fate of men, whose presence tested the honor of kings. To some medieval minds, Helen was the perfect cautionary tale. Priests and scholars spoke of her as a lesson in temptation, a reminder that earthly beauty was fleeting, dangerous, and bound to lead men astray. She was likened to Eve, whose choices in Eden had brought ruin to mankind. Just as Eve reached for the fruit, Helen reached for Paris's hand, and in both stories, the world paid the price. Her face, radiant in memory, was cast as a veil hiding disaster. But in the arts of the Renaissance, when the world turned again to Greece and Rome for inspiration, Helen was reborn. Painters adorned canvases with her likeness, imagined in flowing robes, her golden hair bound with jewels. To them, she was not simply a sinner, but the eternal muse, the very embodiment of classical beauty, a vision that had inspired poetry, war, and legend. Her story was retold in plays, where the grandeur of her beauty became a metaphor for the irresistible force of desire itself. Playwrights and poets of the Renaissance used Helen to explore the tension between fate and free will. Christopher Marlowe, in his famous lines, asked what power could compare to the face that launched 1,000 ships. To him, Helen was no longer just a queen or a cause of war. but the very ideal of beauty so compelling that men would burn cities for a single kiss. Her presence and his words revealed both admiration and dread. For beauty so great is both divine and dangerous. In sculpture and painting, she became an icon of elegance. Artists shaped her as a goddess, standing serene, her features balanced in perfect harmony. Others showed her in anguish, torn between two worlds, a woman caught in the tide of destiny. Always, she was rendered in light that suggested she was more than mortal, her image shining across centuries. Yet beyond art, Helen continued to stir the minds of thinkers. Was she guilty of betrayal, or innocent? Her story twisted by men. Was she a woman who made choices, or a pawn in a game of gods and kings? Renaissance humanists debated her as though she were alive still. Their arguments less about the past than about the nature of humanity itself. Even in modern times, Helen's story has not vanished. Historians and novelists alike return to her name, retelling the Trojan War from her perspective, seeking to grant her a voice too often denied. Some imagine her as a reluctant queen, dragged into a fate she did not choose. Others craft her as a figure of secret strength, who navigated gods and men alike with subtlety and resolve. Feminist writers in particular see her not as the cause of war, but as its scapegoat blamed for decisions made by kings. Her beauty turned into an excuse for male ambition and divine rivalry. The city of Troy itself, once thought only a legend, has been unearthed by archaeologists. Its ruins lie in the soil of modern-day Turkey, stones and walls whispering of fire and battle. When visitors walk among them, they cannot help but think of Helen, standing upon those walls, gazing at the sea where 1,000 ships once gathered. History and myth blur together, yet her presence lingers, as if her shadow still lies upon the stones. Helen of Troy has thus endured for millennia, a figure both adored and despised, remembered not only for her beauty but for the questions she left behind. She is a mirror in which each age sees its own reflection. For the ancients, she was a pawn of gods. For the medievals, a warning against temptation. For the Renaissance, the perfect muse. For the modern age, a woman struggling to be seen beyond the myth. Her legend has no ending, because Helen is not only of the past. She exists wherever beauty is praised and feared, wherever desire clashes with reason, wherever stories remind us that a single life can alter the fate of nations. 8. As centuries unfolded, Helen ceased to be merely a figure of legend. She became an idea, a symbol woven into the very fabric of how humanity thinks about beauty and its consequences. Philosophers, poets, and storytellers across cultures found in her a paradox that could never be fully resolved. She was at once divine and mortal, innocent and guilty, victim and cause, adored and despised. In the writings of later philosophers, Helen often appeared as the embodiment of irresistible beauty, the kind that robs men of reason and bends kings to its will. Plato himself, in dialogues that pondered the nature of love and desire, spoke indirectly of such figures, suggesting that beauty carries with it a divine spark that leads souls upward toward truth. In this sense, Helen became more than a woman. She became a metaphor for the dangerous yet transcendent pull of beauty itself. Writers of the Enlightenment centuries later continued to wrestle with her story. Some saw her as evidence of the chaos that ensues when passion overwhelms duty, when private desire eclipses public order. Others defended her, arguing that the myths about Helen reflected not her own choices, but the anxieties of men who feared the sway of women. Was she the betrayer of her homeland, or was she simply the scapegoat of gods and kings who had already hungered for war? In the Romantic Age, poets rekindled Helen's flame with a new intensity. They were drawn not only to her beauty, but to her sorrow, her tragic aura. To them, she was the eternal muson, unattainable vision that stirred the soul to passion, creativity, and despair. Lord Byron and his fellow romantics spoke of Helen as though she were still alive. Haunting the ruins of Troy, her presence felt in the sound of waves upon the Aegean shore. In their eyes, she was not condemned, but sanctified, a ghostly reminder that beauty and loss are forever entwined. As literature moved into modern times, Helen's voice began to be imagined anew. Novelists and playwrights wrote her not as the silent prize of men, but as the teller of her own tale. Some reimagined her as reluctant, dragged from Sparta against her will. Others dared to grant her agency, showing a woman who chose Paris not from enchantment but from rebellion. Seeking freedom from a marriage that bound her more as symbol than as wife? These modern Helens are complex, flawed, human. They grieve, they desire, they reflect upon the war their lives have shaped. Beyond literature, her name has lingered in every corner of art. In opera, she is the voice that soars above tragedy, lamenting yet unforgettable. In painting, she is captured mid-flight, eyes torn between Troy and Greece. In sculpture, she stands serene, her form embodying the ideal of beauty, while in cinema she has appeared as both queen and enchantress. clothed in the glamour of modern imagination. Philosophically, Helen remains a riddle. To some, she proves that beauty is never innocent, that to be beautiful is to wield power, whether one wishes it or not. To others, she represents the injustice of blame, a woman whose image was used as excuse for male ambition and divine rivalry. For feminists of the 20th and 21st centuries, she has become a figure of reclamation. They ask, what if Helen had been allowed her own story from the beginning? What if her name had not been tied to ruin, but to resilience? And still her myth persists. The ruins of Troy lie uncovered by archaeologists, yet the greater ruins, those of stories, of memory, remain alive. Tourists walk the ancient stones and imagine Helen upon the walls, her gaze fixed upon the horizon. School children read of her in classrooms, their minds filled with the clash of armies and the glimmer of her fabled face. Writers and filmmakers invoke her name whenever they wish to speak of beauty too great to ignore, love too powerful to resist, and consequences too vast to escape. Helen of Troy lives on, not as a single figure, but as many. She is the queen stolen from Sparta, the phantom hidden in Egypt, the goddess lifted to Olympus, the victim of gods, the temptress of men, the eternal muse. Her story has never truly ended, for every age retells it, reshaping her face, her voice, her fate. Perhaps this is her truest immortality. For while Troy burned and kingdoms fell, while men and gods vanished into the silence of history, Helen's name still shines. It is spoken in wonder, in anger, in longing, in fear. It has become eternal. To speak of Helen is to speak not only of a woman, but of the enduring hunger of humanity for stories that explain our deepest conflicts. In her name, we find beauty and destruction, love and betrayal, innocence and guilt woven into a single figure who refuses to vanish from memory. She is less a person than a mirror, reflecting what each age most fears and most desires. In ancient Greece, Helen embodied the peril of unchecked passion and the cruelty of divine interference. She was the price mortals paid when gods treated human lives as pieces in their endless games. For Homer, she was a woman filled with regret, trapped by choices and forces greater than herself. For Euripides, she was either a phantom or a wronged queen, a puzzle that dared to question the very foundation of truth. In later centuries, she became a parable. To the medieval world, Helen was a warning of desire's danger, a reminder that beauty could topple empires. To Renaissance minds, she was the eternal muse, an image of ideal form that lifted the human spirit to art and poetry. To the Romantics, she was a ghost haunting the ruins of Troy, a symbol of longing so deep it burned across the centuries. Yet in our own time, Helen is something else again. She is no longer silent. Writers, scholars, and poets give her words, her own thoughts, her own voice. They imagine what it was to be called the most beautiful woman in the world, to be desired by kings, hunted by armies, blamed for war. Was she weary of being treated as prize and pawn? Did she long for peace, for anonymity, for a life where her face was not a destiny? This retelling transforms her from symbol into human being. A woman who laughed, who wept, who perhaps doubted her own choices and feared the weight of her name. In these stories, Helen is neither villain nor goddess, but something more profound. A woman remembered wrongly, her true self hidden behind the myths of men. But perhaps the truth is that Helen can never belong to one version, one voice, one age. She is all of them at once. The queen of Sparta, the bride of Paris, the guest of Priam, the wanderer of Egypt, the immortal of Olympus, the phantom of tragedy, the muse of poetry. Each face is Helen, and none contain her fully. The power of her legend lies not in certainty but in mystery. We do not know if she chose to leave with Paris, or was carried off against her will. We do not know if she loved him, or if she mourned each life lost because of her. We do not know if she survived Troy to live in peace, or if her fate was darker still. What we do know is that her story has endured longer than the cities that claimed her, outlasting empires, religions, and civilizations. Helen of Troy is eternal because she is the question that cannot be answered. What is the worth of beauty? What is the price of desire? Can one person truly change the fate of nations, or are they only ever swept along by currents larger than themselves? Each retelling offers a different answer, and each generation asks again. And so Helen remains with us. In the ruins of Troy, in the pages of epic poetry, in the strokes of Renaissance art, in the lines of modern novels, in the whispers of philosophers, in the dreams of poets her shadow lingers. She walks among us as an idea, an echo, a legend that time refuses to silence. For as long as humans tell stories, Helen of Troy will be there, not simply as the woman who launched 1,000 ships, but as the unending riddle of beauty and fate. A reminder that some myths do not die because they are not meant to. They live because they speak to something timeless within us. Our longing, our wonder, our fear, our desire. Helen of Troy is not past, she is forever. The tale of Helen does not end in the ashes of Troy, nor in the whispers of ancient poets. It lingers, unbroken, across time, shaping itself to every age. And as long as her name is spoken, her story lives on, not bound to one destiny. but flowing like the endless sea that once carried the 1,000 ships in her pursuit. Legends say that after the war, after the heroes had fallen and the walls of Troy lay broken, Helen returned to Sparta with men. Some imagine her welcomed home with silent forgiveness, others with bitterness that never healed. Yet in every telling, there is a sense of mystery, that her life, whether long or short, mortal or divine, could not be captured by simple endings. For Helen had become something more than mortal. In the temples of Greece, travelers lit fires and whispered her name to the gods, half in prayer, half in fear. To them, Helen was both blessing and curse, a reminder that beauty could uplift or destroy, that desire could bring joy or ruin. In their hearts, they knew her story was not about a single woman, but about the eternal truth that the human soul is drawn to light, even when that light may burn. And so Helen passed into eternity. The poets gave her wings of verse, the sculptors gave her form in stone, the dreamers carried her into visions. She became immortal not through Olympus, nor through divine favor, but through memory. Each age reshaped her, each generation retold her, each tongue spoke her into being once more. But perhaps the greatest mystery of all is this: Helen was never only the sum of her myths. Beneath the legends, beneath the crowns and wars, there was a woman, one who laughed, one who wept, one who bore the weight of a name too powerful to escape. The world remembers her as a goddess, a phantom, a muse, yet somewhere within those layers lies Helen herself, unseen, unknown, eternal. Her story ends where it began, not in Troy, not in Sparta, but in the gaze of those who hear her name. For as long as there are voices to speak, hearts too long, and eyes to marvel at beauty, Helen of Troy will never fade. She is the eternal flame, the face that time itself could not forget. And in the silence after her tale, when the ships are gone and the cities are dust, her echo still lingers, soft, unyielding, immortal. Helen of Troy is not just of the past. Helen of Troy is forever.